future climate scenario event will begin shortly. The future climate scenario event will begin shortly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Junhee Lee at Busan National University and Institute for Basic Science Center for Climate Physics, Republic of Korea. I have served a coordinating lead author of Working Group 1 contribution to IPCC 6 assessment report, and also I'm co-writing team member of synthesis report. I'm one of the organizers of this event and will moderate the first session. On behalf of the organizers and hosts, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Korean Pavilion side event on future climate scenarios, IPCC dialogue with international policymakers on user needs and priorities. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Korea Pavilion to host this event and their excellent service. Thank you. Now, please allow the co-chair of Presidential Commission on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth, Republic of Korea, for his congratulatory remark. Okay, Professor Kim, yes, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. It is my great honor for me to be here with top scientists mostly. My name is Kim Sang-hyuk, and yes, I'm in charge of Presidential Commission for Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth. Before I give you my brief remark or congratulatory remark, I'd like to let you know my major in the university is just international relations. Who doesn't know at all about science, climate science? And my senior, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who went to the same school, who studied the same things like me, one day he confessed to me that when we took the job, the mission of being General Secretary of the UN, and when he decided he must push forward the climate agenda to the world, and then all of a sudden he was surrounded by top scientists like you. And he felt really threatened because he couldn't understand the vocabularies and terminologies and the vast and deep scientific knowledges, but he had no choice but to respect to the findings, scientific findings, which went through tough check and inspection and, if I may say, verification. The same applies to me also. Our climate action and climate policy should, the first starting point is having scientific knowledge. And since I worked for Green Growth more than 12, 13 years ago, my textbook has been always the report of IPCC. So I thank you very much. And in that context, I must say thank you to Professor Jim Ski, who is the IPCC Working Group 3 co-chair, and also Professor Cecilia Nicolini from Argentina, and Patricia Ningiuro, who is IPCC National Focal Point for Kenya, and Dr. Oh Ye Won also. There are many persons I should mention, but yeah, there are too many. And I just say hello to Professor Jimsky. I asked him what did it mean to the IPCC and you, having a chairperson, Mr. Lee, who studied economics. And Professor Jimsky told me he studied physics. And it created great chemistry between physics and economics. That's the thing I like to see. And well, I'm supposed to give some feedback from the user perspective for the future climate scenarios. I like to define the future in a somewhat different way. Peter Drucker, who is the management group in this time, said he defined the future not as a thing that has not come yet. He defined a future that has come already and which is coming, which is going to be bigger. Not just as a risk, but it could be also an opportunity. So we must define the future, something that has come already. That's how we make social policies. So I'd like to recommend the IPCC give us more sense of urgency. First thing I like to recommend. And my favorite report of the various and best report by IPCC is just SPM, Summary for Policymakers, that is made easy for policymakers to understand more easily, but I want it more easy. So as my president, my prime minister of the world, even the king could understand the meaning of the scientific findings of the IPCC. And also, well, so far, the shared social economic pathway, SSP, has been extremely helpful to formulate climate-related policies, and also climate impact drivers was also very good to appreciate our stakeholders in this region. So my best wishes for the forthcoming. You will start the job after getting say yes from the board of the IPCC next March, and then you will start the 7th report. So new adventure will begin shortly. So best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair Kim, for your kind congratulatory remark and also your thought for future direction of IPCC. Thank you. Then now let me invite Mr. Abdallah Musik, the IPCC Secretary, for his welcoming remark.
Thank you very much, you John. And yes, co-chairperson of 2050 Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth Commission, Sang Yoon Kim. IPCC focal point from Argentina, Cecilia Nicoloni. IPCC focal point of Kenya, Patricia. IPCC focal point of Korea, Yan Won Ho. I don't know this man. Might question mark. I have been told his name is Jimsky, but when I looked for the bio, it is a really long bio. Is it? No, I think Jimsky, co-chair of Working Group 3, was really an excellent, person in IPCC. Yes, I think Jan and Anna are supposed to intervene remotely. And also, I should recognize someone in the room, and this provides this meeting very great importance, is the first Vice President of WMO, Mrs. Celeste Saulo. And yes, there are many colleagues in the room, and I think I am really proud to see many of you, many technical support units of Working Group 3 and also other Working Group 2. And I saw our big and very kind Vice President of WMO, Co Barrett. So, and I think that shows if this is that the attendance is excellent. With this high eminent people, this side event, I think for me, till now, it's the best side event I can confess. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to open this event on scenarios, and I wish to thank the Republic of Korea, country of our chair IPCC, Hoo-Soon Lee. So this is, we should recognize this. And also to thank all the bureau members who are doing a great job. We should not forget them. And also, I should also thank all the authors. There are many authors here from developed and developing countries, dedicating their time in voluntary basis to give the IPCC the level we have. And this COP, I decided with the advice from our vice chairs of IPCC and co-chair that we can offer as much as we can possibility to developing countries to attend. I am really proud that we ensure this. Yes, as you know, the physical science basis of our IPCC in 2001 was already delivered, and it was also followed by the report from Working Group 2 on adaptation, and it was also followed by Working Group 3 report after this. That means all the packages there, and I am sure you will listen many of this conclusion in coming presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, our reports are clear, and this is what already the chairman highlighted. He likes summary policymaking, but our objective is to provide the voice of science to decision makers, to stakeholders. And this is, I think, the effort all the Secretariat is doing, and also with the help for technical support units, to make the voice of science as easy, as user-friendly for any stakeholder, any decision maker, and mainly to negotiator. We believe that the dialogue now, today, about the stakeholders' use and needs of information should be listening. Exactly that's what kind of information it is needed. The sixth cycle is the most intense in the history of IPCC. With this whole package, it is like a bouquet. You know, in French, the bouquet is a bouquet of flowers. We have already 7 flowers in this bouquet, and we will have the 8th one in next March. This is a big bouquet, multicolored one, but it is useful for all the negotiators and all the stakeholders. So, the discussion at this event between the scientific community and the policymaker on future scenario, how they are used and communicated, will be useful in identifying knowledge gaps and priorities in adaptation and mitigation policies at all levels. In the context of sustainable development, the implementation of Paris Agreement and Glasgow Pact. So, yes, of course, what will be, provided, presented in this, workshop, I am sure will create an added value. And please take a second to think, to say what kind of information you have now for the future of IPCC, and measure it when the side event is concluded. I am sure we will have a lot of information to take away. Why? Because I trust. In this manner, I don't know. And also the presenter, they will come in their capacity to provide you the best information the science has for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdallah, for your warm and fascinating remark. The co-organizer of this event are Dr. Anna Perani, Head of Technical Support Unit of IPCC Working Group 1, and Dr. Jan Fulsbeth, Vice Chair of IPCC Working Group 1. But unfortunately, they couldn't come, but they will be here online. Anna will give a brief introduction of objectives of the event. The microphone is now on you, Anna.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So welcome to this special event on future climate scenarios. This is a dialogue with international policymakers on user needs and priorities. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank the Korea Pavilion for hosting our session. And thank you, Professor Kim, for your opening remarks. And also thank you, Abdallah, for welcoming us. This event is organized by Jan Vogelsveld, Working Group 1 Vice Chair, Jun Yi, Coordinating Lead Author of Chapter 4 of Working Group 1, and myself, I'm the head of the TSU of Working Group 1, on behalf of the IPCC, but from a cross-working group perspective. We have invited an informal dialogue with representatives of policymakers from around the world to understand more about how future scenarios are used and communicated in their work. So IPCC is holding many side events on the outcomes of the assessment at the Science for Climate Action Pavilion. And our wish here, however, is to create a space that focuses on policymakers and users of scenario-based information more broadly. So this event is part of a package of activities being organized by the IPCC to take stock of the sixth assessment reports, as well as part of the reflections and preparations for the next assessment, and also to inform future research directions in the underlying scientific community. So this is an important discussion we will hold here with policymakers to develop a shared understanding of how policymakers from different regions and different contexts in the world use scenarios and what their priorities and needs are. So we also organize an IPCC workshop on scenarios in preparation of the seventh assessment report, and this will be held in early 2023, and it will be directly informed by the outcomes of this discussion. And other targeted activities that we've organized include a dedicated session at the Second Scenarios Forum in June this year on lessons learned from the assessment and a discussion of future research directions. And we also held a webinar on communicating scenarios to the media and the broad public in October 2022. So back to this event. We will hear from our guests about the uses and needs of information on future climate that can inform policy development, including on adaptation, risk resilience, mitigation, and sustainable development. And what we're interested in is the fit for purpose of scenarios that are assessed by the IPCC, but also other scenario-based information. And we're wanting to identify the knowledge gaps and the priorities for making progress from the perspective of stakeholders, and what would be really relevant for the policy development, including at national and subnational scales, as well as informing the ongoing and future international climate negotiations. So the session will begin with a brief introduction by Jan Vogelsveld on the use of scenarios and coordinated efforts across the IPCC. And then we have a keynote talk by Jim Skee, co-chair of Working Group 3. And he will give us an overview of the assessment of scenarios and identifying challenges and outstanding questions on the development of scenarios that we hope we can discuss in more detail with the panelists and the audience. So the panel discussion will follow, and it will be moderated by Ala Al-Kuradi, Senior Scientist of the Working Group 3 TSU. And each panelist will be first invited to introduce how scenario-based information informs their policy work and how they use and communicate as well scenario-based information. And then a discussion will follow. So thank you very much for being here. I'm very sorry not to be there in person and miss the in-person interactions. But I look forward to this event, and I hand over to Jan, who will set the scene for the session with a brief introduction on the use of scenarios across the IPCC. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for very useful and detailed information. Now the microphone is now on you, Jan. Over to you.
Thank you, Juni, and can you hear me well? I got
Yes.
a strange message here.
Well.
Yeah, very good. And you see my slide?
Not yet. Oh,
okay.
Yes, we can see it, yes.
You see it? Okay, thank you
Yes.
very much.
Jan, we lost you.
Hello?
Yes, you are on now. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so as you know, the sixth cycle has been a very rich and busy cycle. And the use of scenarios has been an integrating and cross-cutting element across the working groups. And the three special reports helped us to develop a new way of working across the disciplines and working groups. And that formed a very useful basis when we started working with a working group report. So this stronger collaboration is something that is special for this cycle. If we look at the different reports from this cycle, we can look at some examples from the use of scenarios. The 1.5 report had 4 illustrative pathways in the summary for policymakers that were very useful for conveying information about different pathways compatible with the 1.5 degree target. And that was the first special report. And the second special report on land use considered climate and changes in land systems and how mitigation played for the land systems. And the third special report on the ocean and cryosphere considered a range of various climate variables relevant in this context, glaciers melt, sea level rise, etc. So we saw already in the special reports that scenarios were a very important element. And then the first working group report that came out last year considered 5 illustrative scenarios, which I will come back to soon. Working group 2 also used scenarios, both in consideration of impacts at various warming levels, and also as one of the important bases for the burning embers, the famous reasons for concerns diagrams. And finally, working group 3 considered hundreds of scenarios, and we will hear more about that from Jim Ski soon. And if we have a look at the 5 illustrative scenarios considered in working group 1, we have a broad range from the very low scenarios, crossing net zero in the 50s and the 70s, and up to very high scenarios, the 8.5 scenario. And feasibility and plausibility was not considered by working group 1. And here we see a diagram for CO2. And of course, in addition, we also consider other gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur dioxide, just as 3 examples. And these 5 illustrative scenarios were used to look at physical responses. And of course, global surface temperature change over the century is a main variable here. And we can see that for all these 5 scenarios, we crossed the 1.5 line in the near term. And we also relate this to the 2-degree ambition. And we can see for the lower scenario, it reaches 1.5 and is slightly above, and then return to below 1.5 towards the end of the century. So these were the main scenarios used in work group 1 for consideration of the physical responses in the climate system, assuming these emissions. And we considered a large range of climate parameters, and here is just an example, sea level rise. And we also considered the regional and temporal variation in the responses here, the maps you can see on the left. And then it's also important to remember that scenarios form a very important basis for consideration of the risk that comes with the future changes when we combine them with vulnerabilities and exposure and the consequences of responses to climate change. And scenarios give information about larger magnitude of the responses, the increased frequency, the new locations, the different timings, and the new combinations of impacts, compound events. So this is so scenarios is a part of the input to the risk framework in AR6. And finally, I would like to show a graph from the Summary for Policymakers in Working Group 3 that puts all the scenarios in AR6 together in one diagram and showing the different categories in scenarios used in Working Group 3, combined with IMPs, which we will hear about, and the different SSPs, etc. I'm not going into details, but this box and indeed this graph gives a very good overview of the total set of scenarios used in AR6. And let me finish by saying that we have had an unprecedented collaboration across working groups on scenarios in AR6. And we have a lot of very useful experience, and it gives us a very good basis for further improvements in the coming cycle. So by that, I would like to say thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for your very useful summary of IPCC scenarios across the report. We now move to the keynote speech. The keynote speaker is Professor Jim Key, the co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3. And Jim is a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London with a research interest in energy, climate change, and technological innovation. He will give a talk on IPCC assessment of scenarios, issues, and challenges. Please join me to welcome Jim. Thank you. So I will let you know 5 minutes before finishing your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, and also thank you to Jan and Anna for trusting a Working Group 3 co-chair to give the keynote at a Working Group 1 event. And can I also say, since the end of the 6th cycle is only 8 months away at the moment, many of us are getting much more relaxed and being a bit more personal in the remarks that we make. So noting that Abdallah has left the room, I would like to disagree with one thing that he said in his introduction, because he said IPCC reports are clear. Now, these are where we are with scenarios, all the terminology we use to confuse policymakers. We have illustrative scenarios in Working Group 1, we have illustrative mitigation pathways, which are a different concept in Working Group 3, and you can see all of the various terms there. So what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is to just give a kind of helicopter view of how the scenarios are produced, how IPCC assesses them, give quite a personal view on some of the challenges that come from what we've done already, and then I will do a shameless advertisement for the workshop on scenarios, which we will be holding next April. So first point to start, there are no IPCC scenarios, and this is a point we're constantly making to third parties. There are only scenarios produced by the research community that are assessed by IPCC. And this was a very specific decision of IPCC back at its 24th session, which said it wouldn't develop any new scenarios itself, but would facilitate a process that worked out in the community. And in fact, the Integrated Assessment Modelling Consortium was established a couple of years later to help create that kind of bridging role. So an overview of the process, where do scenarios come from? Well, obviously different research groups out there have modelling tools in the top right-hand corner. They need to design the scenarios and the input assumptions that are put into the models, and at that point people produce the scenarios. That is entirely up to the scientific community to do that. It's not IPCC's job. IPCC only comes in when the scenarios are assessed. But let's face it, there is a kind of a feedback process by which the way that the scenarios are assessed moves back, and quite clearly the research community takes account of what IPCC does and even plans for IPCC cycles in developing the scenarios that it produces. The modelling tools, I've put them into 3 groups here with a Working Group 3 and Working Group 1 perspective. So in Chapter 4 of Working Group 1, we've got the general circulation models and the Earth system models. In Chapter 7 of Working Group 1, we've got the simpler climate models which emulate what the much more detailed models do. Remembering the big models, when you press enter and the model starts running, it can take a very long time to run. The simple emulators can move much more quickly and can do things probabilistically, which is a big advantage. And then over at the bottom right, for Working Group 3, we've got the integrated assessment models, and they're all part of the process that IPCC assesses. I'll skip this one because this slide, which you can tell is from Working Group 1 because it has such high production values compared with Working Group 3. But what it is essentially based on is the kind of the causal chain at the bottom left, from drivers, GDP, population, emissions, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which moves into Working Group 1 territory, climate projections, and then onto the impacts in green from Working Group 3. So there's a kind of a causal process, and although it doesn't look like Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 are connected, there is a connection in the development of the shared socioeconomic pathways, which I will be coming on to. Now, in terms of the basic building blocks for scenario, there are 2 elements that are important. And I want just to mention the representative concentration pathways, because they don't start at the start of that causal chain I put in the previous slide. They start in the middle with concentrations of gases in the atmosphere that add up to specific levels of radiative forcing measured in watts per square meter. And the reason for doing that is that the climate modelers couldn't wait for the people in Working Group 3 to produce emission scenarios. So by starting in the middle, they can both work at the same time, and the Working Group 3 people can work backwards to figure out what emissions were consistent with the so-called RCPs, and then the climate modelers from Working Group 1 can move onwards and look at the detailed climate scenarios, and also produce downscaling. There are, the atlas of climate impacts from this cycle was a major advantage to help with assessment in Working Group 2. Second big element, by the way, the representative concentration pathways were devised at the start of the 5th cycle, and so could be taken account on the AR5 report. There was an ambition to have the shared socioeconomic pathways ready as well, but they were not ready till 2014, right at the end of the cycle. So it's only with the special reports this cycle and AR6 that they've actually come up. And what these are doing is essentially telling stories about the development of the world in socioeconomic terms along 2 axes, one of which is socioeconomic challenges for adaptation, the other one socioeconomic challenges for mitigation. And I don't need to go into detail, but the key point is that the RCPs from the physical side and the SSPs from the socioeconomic side could be combined in that matrix at the bottom right, which we clearly get the message is very complicated for policymakers to deal with. So the trick there was to actually identify a smaller number of these SSP-RCP combinations, which are illustrated by that red line that's snaking over the matrix at the moment. Now, these were called things like SSP2 4.5. Policymakers didn't like that much at the Working Group 1 approval and took the bold step of just calling them very low, low, intermediate, high, and very high. And that is giving us a strong message about the kind of the simple approaches that are easier, I think, to move into policy. So when you design a policy, the elements of it are, the models are sitting in the middle that our research community might use. So the RCP-SSP framework is an important input to that. And Tejal, I hope you're going to give some heavy comments on that later, because it's these that drive much of the outcome, I have to say. There are detailed technical assumptions, things like the cost of solar PV, which will vary from one model to another. But modelers tend to get together in things called model intercomparison projects, where different models are run, but they try to match the basic assumptions, and you see how much the modeling difference makes. So the kind of things that would be there for scenario assumptions would be shared assumptions about policy, emission trading schemes, etc. Whether or not the NDCs are applied till 2030, what kind of technology constraints, say for bioenergy, might be in place. And very critically, and I couldn't emphasize this enough, a usual assumption is that they assume a carbon budget over the 21st century to drive their outputs. So the models are run, they produce emissions and removals estimates, they produce estimates of the kind of mitigation measures, and then that is put into the database that is analysed by IPCC. Now, I just wanted to stop on the carbon budget for just a second, because it's an elephant in the room assumption that, in my view, does not get enough attention from the modelers. We often talk about models that are compatible, say, with 2 degrees warming at a given likelihood, but the models don't put the modelers and the IMs don't put 2 degrees into their model. They note that carbon dioxide emissions accumulate, and there's a heavy correlation between temperature and cumulative CO2, and they constrain their models by the amount of CO2 over the 21st century, say from 2020 to 2100. The other thing that happens there is that the costs are discounted over time. And some of the models calculate their own discount rates internally. Sometimes it's external, in which case it's typically 5%. But if you look at how 5% accumulates over 80 years over the century, you get a factor of 50. So an abatement measure that costs $250 a tonne in 2020 will only look as though it costs $5 a tonne by the you get to 2100. And because of the availability of negative emission measures that will start to look cheap by the end of the century, it's one of the very big explanatory factors why we get so many negative emission technologies and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage in the models. And we need to say this, it's an elephant in the room assumption, but it really explains a lot of why the models do what they do. Now, one of the things, of course, the modelers have been criticized for the amount of BECS that goes into the scenarios. So with the very best of intentions, they did something new in a project called Engage, where they did a 2-stage carbon budget over the 21st century. They set a carbon budget up to the time of carbon dioxide net zero, and then they had a zero carbon budget after that. And the outcome of that is it looks like the blue lines for greenhouse gas emissions that you can see in the diagram. So there are faster emission reductions if you do that before net zero. You get close to net zero emissions after the time of net zero, though you still need CO2 to balance hard to abate sectors. But the consequence then also is that you also get positive GHG emissions from the other gases. Therefore, there is never a balance between GHG sources and sinks during the 21st century. And this obviously did not go down well at the Working Group 3 approval for some countries, but it was a direct consequence of the innocent attempt to get rid of so much BECS in the scenarios. So I will going to go through, because I'll go through quickly because I'm already getting the signal. But basically the analytical approaches used in the IPCC assessment was to define scenario categories. There are many thousands out there, and define them by the climate outcome in terms of warming level, the likelihood of that warming level, and if it's appropriate, the degree of overshoot. And that gives rise to the C1 to C8 categories. But there's also an attempt to pick out a small number of scenarios that represent different sort of emblematic kind of emission strategy approaches. I'm not going to go through this one but in too much detail, but just to flag, We got 3,000 scenarios deposited in that database. Almost 1,000 were national or sectoral, so you couldn't do a global assessment on them. They were then vetted and screened out from those that were so far away from historical trends they weren't really credible, and then they were further screened by those that produced enough information on key greenhouse gases that you could then run them through a climate emulator to produce the temperature outcomes. Now, there were just a few innovations in AR6. I've mentioned the fact that there are national and regional, sectoral scenarios as well as global, and there was much more effort at transparency. The scenarios database was criticized because our modelers weren't revealing their assumptions about key things like PV costs. Now we have inputs as well as outputs, so that's transparent. And we have a full Annex 3 on scenarios and modeling methods, which includes descriptions of the tools, classification of scenarios, treatment of uncertainty, and how this vetting process was actually undertaken. I struggle to understand some of that, so I'm not sure how much transparency has actually been addressed there. So I want to finish off, and this is kind of my personal views, and they are personal, on what issues with the process. So the first one is inclusivity in scenario design and the IPCC scenario and architecture. And this is a division of the scenarios in the database according to the underlying shared socioeconomic pathway. So you can see over 90% of them were the middle of the road scenario, SSP2, with very few in SSP1, which is the sustainable development one, and even fewer in the other scenarios. And just to say that was a big disappointment to me, because if we'd had quantification, we could have made a much better case about the need for non-incremental change in order to secure emission objectives. Second one, the concentration in a small number of models and modelling teams. This is the most provocative slide of all. These are the models in the scenario database, and 5 models account for more than 3/4 of the scenarios, and they are all based with European teams funded by the European Union. And, you know, as a Brit who no longer holds an EU passport, I'm very pro-European, but there's an issue that needs to be dealt with here about the inclusiveness and the teams coming in. One thing, observing the boundary between research. Do authors remember when they are researchers and when they are carrying out an assessment under the IPCC process? Because many of the people who are doing the assessment are also the researchers whose work is being assessed and who are also leading groups like the Integrated Assessment Modelling Consortium. I had a very provocative slide on this, but I took it out in case some of the modellers were there. The administrative burden of submission to the scenarios database. Again, innocently, to raise transparency, there was a requirement for much more data in AR6 than previously. But the stories we are getting is that put off some modelling teams because the burden of putting submission data was just too large. There's another one, which is the lack of time for the scenario assessment. The database was open until the 11th of October last year, which was the cut-off date for literature. And that gave the people doing the assessment very little time to actually carry out the vetting process and analysis. So it was due to dependence on the availability of the climate emulators from Working Group 1. It meant it was too late to fully socialise the scenarios across all the other chapters in the group. And as some focal points will recognise, there were revisions to scenario numbers both prior to and even during the approval process as people discovered little mistakes and little errors in there. So I think a big challenge there. And finally, the transparency of scenarios and modelling, for me, is too technically complex, and we need to push it much more for policymakers. So I won't go right through the IPCC workshop on scenarios. It will take place in Bangkok at the end of April, and it has both scientific aims related to scenario structure, and it has process aims about the governance of scenarios and the way the research community interacts with IPCC. And Junyi is getting panic about me overgoing time, so I'll bring it to a halt there.
Okay, thank you, Ji, for your fabulous talk. I feel it's comprehensive, transparent, and also honest. Okay, so we have some time for questions. So, question or any comment? So,
yeah, thanks a lot for the excellent talk, Tabea Lisna. I'm an author of the Working Group 2 and was lead author in the Water chapter. I just agree with all of the, I guess, also issues that you've listed on the last slide. And I just want to add, I guess, I would really hope for the scenario process going forward also to maybe consider a little bit more adaptation and impacts, because I feel that's, if not one elephant, maybe several that are quite big in the room, especially looking at SSP number 5, for example, where it's associated with low challenges to adaptation. But we've seen in the Working Group 2 that that's certainly an issue. So I really hope that going forward we can discuss that a little bit more.
do you have any response?
Well, just to say, I do think we got the impression that there was less of a culture of scenarios in Working Group 2 than there was in Working Groups 1 and 3. And I think that's certainly something that needs to be addressed in the cycle.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. And I'm wondering, some of the policymakers want more detail. For example, your data provide a global scenario is too close, and they want to downscale using another model to downscale maybe 1 kilometer, 100 kilometers, 10 kilometers, or 5 kilometers, or 500 meters. I'm wondering, such kind of the downscale is meaningful or not?
Right, okay, in terms of downscaling, can I just say this is very much, I think, something for Working Group 1 and 2 who are moving that direction. I think the atlas you've got is there. I think on the mitigation side and downscaling on the socioeconomic side, I think that's actually much harder to do, because there's so many national and local specificities. And actually a different approach there would be to take the approach we did in Chapter 4 of the report, which is try to assess national scenarios and more think about adding up rather than scaling down. So I think it depends on the question.
Jim, just one question. I mean, we realized in AR6 the demand side could not be really modeled, because as you showed, that it's the GDP and the demographics which are really driving the models, right? But then we need an economic structure which does not only look into one metric of GDP, but then different metrics. So I do agree with you that we need to look into the bottom up and then go and compare. But how can we improve that? That will be one important issue, how we can bring in at least more than one metric. And the other thing is about how do we get the service, just not the product-based economic structure, but then service-based economic structure.
I mean, just to say, you could, for example, drive these models in a different direction by using welfare indicators, perhaps, rather than simple, economic cost indicators to drive them. The demand side is tricky. These models are mostly techno-economic in character, and they've grown up in that kind of way. So you can perhaps build energy efficiency and these technical things into them, but where you're looking at more behavioral kind of issues, my feeling is it's got to be built more in the storyline and the assumptions if you're going to do that. You cannot do everything in a model. Just I should have said right at the beginning, models are not truth machines, they're aids to help you think, and let's keep them that way. Yeah.
Just one additional point I want to highlight is that because many a time we hear in the discussions that SSPs are, all these 5 SSPs are really not representing what the shared socioeconomic paths are for different countries. So they are really not representative. So how can that be addressed in here? Might be an interesting challenge for AR7.
Yeah, well, I think also the issue is I don't think a global integrated assessment model can answer all questions. And if you're looking for the implications of national specificity, frankly, I would start at the other end and add up from the bottom rather than try to do everything down from the top.
So this is Fahad, and my question is on one of the slides you showed that 3/4 of the scenarios which are considered are based on 5 models, and those are European models. No? My question is about the rest of the 1/4 model. So how many of them are developed in developed world as compared to the developing world?
Yeah. I'm sure we're going to hear that when the panel comes along. I mean, I think there are many some developing country teams being built into these European projects. What I think would be interesting is to build them earlier at the design stage, where the questions, where the model intercomparison projects are actually coming along. I should say there are some side conversations running, here at COP about ways in which more developing country teams could be funded and supported to build their own capacity. And I think some of the philanthropies are actually very keen in putting money in that direction.
Okay, any other question? If not, then I think we should move to the next one. Let's give a big round of applause to Jim again. Thank you so much. I think it was a very useful talk and also very nice scene setting for the next panel discussion. Now I will hand over to the microphone to Dr. Ala Al-Kordaji, who is a senior scientist at the Technical Support Unit of IPCC Working Group 3 and research fellow at Imperial College London. Okay, so Ala, over to you. Then I will invite the panelists.
And I'll move down.
So maybe you go.
Yeah.
No, I need it. I need it. I need the paper. Okay. Thank you very much, Uni, and it's my pleasure to be moderating the discussion of this excellent panel we have here with us today, and especially after hearing the opening remarks of, including the keynote from Jim. Just a bit of a background, if I may, about my horse in this race, if I can use this analogy. Throughout my work with Working Group 3 TSU, I've been heavily involved with the scenarios or mitigation scenarios work stream. I also had the pleasure and the fortune to work with colleagues from Working Group 1 who work on climate scenarios. And taking the lead from Jim, if I can also have some personal remarks, perhaps not as strong as his, I may provide some insider information to colleagues here and to the audience with us online. During Working Group 3 approval session, which was hosted virtually for the most part, the Technical Support Unit and the Bureau has gathered together and co-located in a hotel outside London. And in that hotel, we had a room we called the Scenarios Room.
And in that room, there was Andy Reisinger, who Working Group 3 Vice Chair, Jan Fugles-Fitz, Working Group 1 Vice Chair, Anna Pirani, we've heard from her, Head of Technical Support Unit of Working Group 1, and myself. And we were camping there all the time, following up the scenarios work stream, and I can tell you that the scenarios work stream went down to the wire in our approval. So the reason I'm providing these insights and these remarks to stress that this is a very intricate and important topic, and demanded and continue to demand a lot of our attention across all working groups of the IPCC and from all those who are involved in the process. And when you sit from the TSU side or from the Bureau side, you can see how different stakeholders involved in this process interact with the topic itself from different perspectives and focus on different aspects. And you can also have them interact among each other and with the wider assessment of the topic. But enough from me, because I'm sure as me, you would like to hear from our excellent panelists who represent policymakers from around the world, and to hear I'm sure they have a lot to say on this topic. So if I may introduce them, with us we have Cecilia Nicolini, starting here from my left. We have Cecilia Nicolini. She is the State Secretary of Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation, and she is the focal point of UNFCCC and IPCC in Argentina. We have Patricia Nyumuru. She is the IPCC focal point for Kenya. We have Denise Joseph. She's a program associate at the Caribbean Cooperative MRV Hub. We have Tejal Kanektar. She is a professor of Indian National Institute of Advanced Studies. Also, we have Elizabeth Gilmore. She's associate professor of environmental science and policy at Carleton University, IPCC Working Group 2 lead author, and she's a senior advisor for science and technology at the Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we have Ya Won-oh, IPCC National Focal Point for Republic of Korea. So the way we are going to run this panel discussion, we have 1 hour. We are going to spend the first half an hour where I would like to invite each member of the panel to reflect within 5 minutes, if possible, at how scenarios-based information inform their policy context, and describe to us how scenarios are used and communicated in their own governments. In the second half an hour, then we will have the opportunity, the panelists will have the opportunity to continue the discussion, but more of an interactive mode among each other, and also with the audience here in the pavilion and online. So please, member of the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them and to prepare them as we run through the first half. I'll keep an eye during the remarks and the opening remarks of our panelists to emerging themes and hot topics, and I'm sure there are plenty there. And we will cover that in the remainder of our panel. And then after we finish the panel, we will invite Jim for final reflections, and then Yuni for her closing remarks, if I may. I have here, to our members of the panel, I have here 1 minute sign, so I'll just reach out once you reach your 4th minute, so please pay attention to that. I'm very much keen on sticking to the time constraint we have here with us today. Okay, so starting with Cecilia, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we are all women here in this panel. Women in science, women policymakers. This is fantastic, right? It's for you for organizing this. This is really, really, really great. And the first thing I have to say, I'm a policymaker from Argentina, so I have to say thank you. Thank you for all the works, and thank you for all the tremendous contribution that the IPCC and all these scenario-based and the information that we use a lot to design our policies is really, really, really important. For us, climate change has become a state policy. It's more than a government goal. That's why it's so important that we design our policies science-based that are really, really robust. So with any change of government, really those policies not only can remain, but even being updated and continue the work that we started doing. And also that I have to celebrate and acknowledge is that in 2020, the IPCC report had more contributors from the Global South, from developing countries and from developed countries. And that is also something that is very, very important, like the last report as well. And we believe that we need more information from the South to really face different problems and struggles that we are facing. As you know, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most unequal region in the world. Therefore, we are really suffering, as well as our colleagues in Africa, really as a very heels of climate change. So we really need this information and the perspective in order to build all this policy with our perspective in adaptation, in mitigation, in loss and damages, and how we can give answers to our society. And I have to say that actually during this COP and yesterday we released our National Adaptation Plan for 2030. It was a big milestone for Argentina, and we use a lot of the information that you produce and scenario planning in order to really commit our international to fulfill our international commitments in terms of reducing our emissions, but at the same time our national goals of adaptation and resiliency of our people and our territory. So we are very proud that finally we could get into this very robust plan that in the end it's a national development plan. It's even more than climate change because it really affects all the sectors, agriculture, energy, transportation, housing, food system, almost everything, which is very important. And also we submitted yesterday our long-term strategy for carbon neutrality by 2050. It's now in the convention. So again, we will need now to develop these scenarios in order to see how we can attain that objective in 2050. And of course, all the science and the metrics and information that you provide is very important. And actually, we are updating all these projections with of the latest global climate models by an Argentine team as well of specialists in order to be very focused on the need that we have as a country. And just to, I don't know if you put the sign of 1 minute, okay, I'm good. And we are working a lot also with other national agencies that provide very important information, like the National Meteorological System, that actually is run by a woman as well, and now she is a candidate for the International Organization of Meteorological Organization. She's running for Secretary General, so our country is backing her. Now 1 minute. So just to wrap up, I believe that all this information gather what we do in our countries, what we share with our scientific community, and we co-create together, and all the information of these international organizations that also can help us make our plans more robust by science-based and project better our scenarios are key to help us design our climate policy and really be able to tackle climate change for our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. If I may move to Patricia, please.
Thank you. So I'd also like to appreciate the scene setting that has been done. We've seen how the development of the scenarios is done. And we, as Kenya, would like to also appreciate the work that the IPCC does in providing scenarios for us. So in talking about how we use them to influence our policy, I will use two examples. So one is the Climate Change Act that we developed in 2016, which is a legal framework for addressing climate change. And this Climate Change Act actually mandates us to develop National Climate Change Action Plan. And so currently we are in the back end of our current action plan, which is 2018 to 2022. And we are currently working on developing the next action plan for 2023 to 2027. And this action plan is on particular sectors, so disaster risk management, food and nutrition, wildlife, human settlements, energy, and transport. So in the development of the current National Climate Action Plan that we have, we used the high emission scenarios that are found in the IPCC 2013 Working Group 1 report, And what we use is it showed us that mean annual temperature is expected to increase by 0.9 by 2035, 2.2 by 2065, and by 4 degrees by 2100. So for example, in developing adaptation responses for impacts of temperature rise, we address the worst possible impact. So what do we expect when we have really high temperatures by a certain period of time? And for example, the co-occurrence of drought and temperatures, which would result, for example, in more forest fires, and therefore we developed plans to address this in case they do happen. And we also follow a participatory approach. So the science says we will be at a certain temperature level by a certain year. What do the particular stakeholders say? How do the science interact with the sectors to enable us to plan for the future? So we take also into account the fact that these scenarios are not forecasts. They are just plausible futures that we should be able to plan around. And so for adaptation, we use the high emission scenarios, and for mitigation, we use the low emission scenarios. So this enables us to contribute towards a reduction of emissions, but also to prepare ourselves in case we are faced with the worst case scenario. So for now that the IPCC AR6 reports are out, we are kind of trying to enable our policymakers move from using RCPs to using SSPs, or combining the use of these two to be able to make decisions. So because I work as a climate scientist, so I'm right at the interface between the production of science and the policymakers. We develop policy briefs, and in these policy briefs, we target particular ministries, and this enables them to be able to understand where are we, what does the science tell us with respect to where we are now and where are we headed. And we would make plans in line with that. On communication, so we have experience with communicating uncertainties that are associated with forecasts, but uncertainties associated with scenarios has been a very new area for us in communication. And so the SPM, or the figures that the IPCC provides, have been something that we've really relied on to enable us to visualize the different scenarios and where they take us in the future. So for example, we try and inform our policymakers that it is easier to simulate large-scale processes than really local-scale processes such as local rainfall. And the figures have been really useful in helping us to do that. Yeah, so I think in our context, that's what I would like to focus on. And I think I've saved you a minute.
No, you have 1 more minute to go. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Denise, please.
Thank you very much. And let me just take this first opportunity
would you mind closing? Would you mind speaking closer to the microphone?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, great. So let me take this first opportunity to introduce myself. I am from the island of St. Lucia, and I've been involved in the IPCC process for all 3 working groups representing St. Lucia. I also lead the Modeling and Projections program for the Caribbean Cooperative Measurement Reporting and Verification Hub, mainly concentrating on emission scenarios. So as my fellow panelists indicated, I want to thank the IPCC for the work they have done to be able to inform policymakers, and the hard work of the scientists during the IPCC reporting process. We give our hats off to you every time. So just to give some context, we recently completed the Earth Information Day, where the increased demand and need for data was highlighted. For small island developing states, the need for data is ever increasing, and therefore the need to include this information in major policy decisions. States have been very involved in the IPCC process and advocating for scenarios from scientists which describe real-world situations, but also give regional specific information and consideration for small island developing states. Scenarios for states are extremely important. Although previously scenarios were mainly used to project GHG emissions, but they are very useful in assessing the climate vulnerability and adaptive capacity, especially for small island developing states. The IPCC reports and scenarios clearly indicate the dire situation that we are all in. particularly for small island developing states who are vulnerable and face many challenges to the increasing impacts of climate change. Scenarios are helpful in helping us establish this baseline. Where are we now? What do we need to do to get to our targets? Scenarios on physical changes also help to inform priorities for adaptation, because it is important that we prepare for such changes, as we know based on the scenarios again that we are nowhere near the path to limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. Therefore, it is important for us to have clear, well-informed scenarios to inform our policies. Even the lowest of the shared socio-economic pathways, SSP 1.9, indicate that 1.5 degrees will be breached, and the risk for seeds will increase by tenfold. Once 1.5 degrees is breached, the reality is that some of our islands will no longer exist. My island, St. Lucia, is fully dependent on tourism. Increased frequency of tropical storms, sea level rise, and other dreadful impacts will result in serious economic damages to these small island developing states. And this is similar to all small island developing states. So this is just to give you a perspective on why scenarios are extremely important to small island developing states. And this is a situation that we live in daily. So the scenario development is important for us to understand those gaps and how we negotiate for better ambitions, what's going to happen in the near future, and can we really adapt to such changes? Because some of us may be gone at the rate we're going. Also, the development of early warning system that can help countries adapt to devastating impacts of climate change. How can we improve the resolutions for some of these systems? So we have tropical cyclones, the frequencies, and we're also always stumped with the fact that we have very, very limited data and monitoring systems for small island developing states. So just to give some perspective in St. Lucia on how sorry, my computer just went haywire, and how we've used scenarios, thank you, and how we've used scenarios development in our NDCs. We take an approach, a holistic approach, where we have stakeholders. We gather stakeholders, we get buy-in from stakeholders, we develop our assumptions with stakeholders while we develop our emission scenarios on a national perspective. And that way we get in all the information necessary to put the assumptions together to develop scenarios for the national perspective. So this is how St. Lucia has developed their NDCs, and that goes for many of the other Caribbean islands, because under the Caribbean Cooperative MRV Hub, we've been able to assist Caribbean islands in developing their NDCs through that same process. And so just to wrap up, it's important that we have very, very robust scenario development data across the regions, and especially for small island developing states. Data and monitoring systems are extremely important to us. And once again, we want to say thank you to the IPCC scientists and to the IPCC process for putting it out there and helping our policymakers develop their work and documents to inform how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Thank you. If I may now move to Tijal, please.
Thank you, Ala, and thank you especially because I'm sure you know what I'm going to say.
I had a preview yesterday, yes.
So I am not going to restrict my comments to the IPCC Working Group 1 alone, since Professor Jimsky also spoke about all the working groups and scenarios across the working groups. I will also talk about all of them. But let me begin by saying that I think something that my colleague mentioned during the Working Group 1 approval session. And the Secretary also said that the role of the IPCC is to bring science. We tell policymakers what the science is. And so the role of the IPCC and the role of scientists in general, our responsibility must be to tell policymakers what they ought to know, not tell them what they want to hear. I think that's an important distinction because I think with the Working Group 1, that story unfortunately the story with net zero has been somewhat different. The working group 1, for example, very clearly says that while reaching net zero is a geophysical necessity, it's the total carbon budget that is important to limit temperature, limit global warming to any particular level. This is very clear in the SPM, it's very clear in the reports, it's very clear across the scientific literature. Unfortunately, it is not present in the IPCC outreach of their own reports. The focus really very overwhelmingly is on net zero alone. Now the issue with the SSPs is that I'm talking about working group 1 here still, and the issue that policymakers have with the labeling of SSPs, I must differ here with Professor Ski again. It's not simply that they are confusing. After all, SSP 1 or SSP 2 are labels. You can call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the term SSP is shared socio-economic pathways, which means that these SSPs basically are combinations of a range of economic and social assumptions, basically largely constructed in the view and perspectives of scientists of 5 modeling teams sitting in the European Union. Right, and so this is the view of modelers from one part of the world for what the world, for the rest of the world should look like, what the world should look like in 2050, what it should look like in 2100. And so when you use the terminology of shared socio-economic pathways, are we endorsing those assumptions that have gone into those pathways? And then that's not the job of Working Group 1. Working Group 1 is supposed to think of these only as emissions pathways. And within a carbon budget, you can have multiple pathways of emissions. I think that's what is important in terms of policy for us. If you have, for example, extremely rapid reductions now, if developed countries take the lead in reductions now, you can have a longer tail in the future, so that less developed countries who do not have the capacities to build their infrastructure today will still be able to do so some years from now. All the carbon budget will not be exhausted in the next 10 or 20 years by those who have the capacity to exhaust it today. I think that's the, so you can have multiple trajectories within a particular global carbon budget, and that is what we get from these scenarios in some sense, and how we can think about scenarios. You can have multiple scenarios, and if you have one kind of scenario, because the carbon budget is a global commons, but it's rivalrous. If region A takes it, it is not available to region B, and so therefore, for example, if you have increased fossil fuel use, as you're seeing across developed countries today, the trajectories that we were talking about last year have already changed this year. They're no longer the same. And we are not going to, when we talk about meeting targets for 2030, even if we assume those targets are met, the total cumulative emissions till those targets are met are going to look very different, because you have increased fossil fuel use in the near term. Right? And so these are important aspects, I think, of the scientific findings of the IPCC, which unfortunately in the scenario language get lost. And it's for us, therefore, there are a lot of things that we can take home to policymakers from the IPCC. Scenarios, unfortunately, are not one of those things. Largely also because if you go to, again, where the shared socioeconomic pathways come from, what the assumptions are. I think Professor Ski has already spoken about the fact that there's a small small set of modelers that are putting out most of the scenarios. In fact, in the others wedge that you had in your pie chart, a large chunk is the GCAM model, which is basically North America, right? So you have a very small number of models that are coming from the global south. And if you actually look beneath what is, all of these, the IPCC provides largely global results, but all of these models arrive at the global results by making regional assumptions. And the regional assumptions, as Professor Roy pointed out, not only don't take demand side considerations into account, but project highly unequal outcomes for a large majority of the developing world into the future, in terms of consumption variables, in terms of GDP variables, in terms of fossil fuel, not just fossil fuel use, which reduces of course, but also in terms of energy use itself. They project highly unequal outcomes. So what is it that we can take home to our policymakers from these scenarios? I think what is important about the climate scenarios, and I agree with some of my colleagues here on the dais, is the impacts that we can assess from these, the idea that you will have larger impacts. But even here, I think we must be careful about how we communicate this, because a large part of the communication to policymakers happens through media. And if you're not careful about a balance, to say that yes, we have less time, there is urgent action required, but we can protect our people. I think that is something that does come out of the working group too, and it's something that we can take home to our policymakers.
Thank you very much, Tuja. Thank you. We move to Elizabeth, please.
Thank you. Today I'm speaking to you as a senior advisor to the focal point of the Canadian government to the IPCC, and also on behalf of my colleague Elizabeth Bush, who's in the negotiation rooms right now. We would like to start by thanking the IPCC in that many of the products that accompany these scenarios allow the Canadian government to produce products that are used throughout Canada. Where we find these used are especially the RCP output. These are used in our national climate assessments. These are used by our climate services to help provide the information to our adaptation practitioners. Where we find, though, that we use them a little bit less is perhaps a bit disappointingly when it comes to our policy work. In our policy work, the Canadian government relies primarily on our own scenarios. We like our own finance projections and our socioeconomic projections. We look towards the SSPs as a way to bound the information that we're providing, but we find that our internal needs are not met by the type of information that's available in the SSPs. We find that it can be useful when looking at the rest of the world. We appreciate the breadth that is available, but it can be more challenging to articulate this to our policymakers. It is difficult to situate the types of futures that they envision for Canada within some of these frameworks. Some of this may stem from the large breadth that we see within these scenarios. And so questions arise when we're communicating them about the plausibility, about some of the transparency around these. I think, Jim, you did a very nice job of articulating that the databases and some of the information available can be difficult to translate into a policy context. And we found that to be broadly true with our policymakers as well. And so while we look towards these IPCC scenarios for what they can provide in terms of communication, in terms of giving our policymakers a sense of the bounds of what is available, what is plausible, often when it comes to the development of our NDCs, for example, we use our internal capacities to really guide those efforts. And so when our sort of big take-homes that we had was really to try to improve some of the communication and some of the socialization around these scenarios so that we can work with our policymakers earlier in the cycle. By the time that we're rolling out some of these products, it is actually a very difficult time to communicate both the results and the assumptions that underpin the scenarios. We also heard this from our climate services as well. They very much want to use all of this information, and they are using it creatively, and it is making a tremendous difference. However, the changes in the scenarios that often occur during the process are difficult for our agencies, for our scientists, to always incorporate in a contemporaneous sense. And so they feel a bit as if we're lagging a bit behind as far as providing the best of the science to the, especially outward towards the practitioner communities. So I have my comments there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And last but certainly not least, Yuan, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Nice to meet you. I'm Yeono, the Deputy Director of Climate Policy Division in Korea. Korea Meteorological Administration, KMA, and also the IPCC focal point of the Republic of Korea. The KMA does main role in managing and responding Korea's activities related to the IPCC. Before we start, firstly, I would like to appreciate for all related people and the IPCC. IPCC all effort to make this meaningful event, and Professor Juniri to give me such a great opportunity. And also, I would like to appreciate the IPCC to make such a great scenario and report, since IPCC report is some kind of like Bible in Korea. For example, special report 1.5 degree was 1.5 degree was reflected in our basic law of carbon neutral, our basic law of carbon neutrality, and the working group one report approved last year is also reflected in the carbon neutral scenario. Carbon neutral scenario. And yes, and since I work at the KMA, I would like to introduce the current AR6 scenario producing method and some using cases by focusing on the KME's activities. However, since I am not expert, some kind of like doctor or researcher in the field of scenario, I would like to ask for your understanding in advance that my explanation might be brief and love to you. And the KMA produces climate change scenarios based on the SSP scenarios, and also uses them to provide climate change forecast and adaptation. There are three scenarios provided by KMA currently: global and downscaling East Asia, and also the downscaling South Asia is divided by spatial resolution. And we also provide the global scenario in the four SSP scenario: SSP 1, 2, 3, and 5. And for East Asia, also four SSP scenarios, and in South Korea, we only provide two scenarios: SSP 2 and 5. Yes, and also these scenarios are used to support some decision making related to climate change response of other ministries, and also support local government to adapt to climate change. And yes, one example is it's about establishing the basic plan for national climate change adaptation measures. For certain ministries, including the Ministry of Environment, have agreed to use the SSP scenarios produced by the KMA. when establishing the adaptation measures. Therefore, the KMA measures. So that's why so I mean that IPCC scenarios is very important for the Republic of Korea. Yes. And yes, also we also so KMA assesses scenario of national and private organization which produces scenarios to use in national policies based on the IPCC scenarios. I think it can enhance the reliability of future climate change forecasts in various fields and help to establish optimal climate change adaptation measure in each ministry. Yes, for me, yes, let me also briefly outline our future plans. In addition to improving the performance of the model used in scenarios, the KMA plans to build something like carbon neutral climate experience system that directly reflect the greenhouse gas emission reduction, NDC pathways. This is expected to provide effective future forecast information when implementing the greenhouse gas reduction policies according to the Paris Agreement. Since I focused on the KMA, KMA is using IPCC scenario in something like climate forecast, science, and adaptation. But for other ministries, they will use IPCC scenario in mitigation ways. Also, so I would like to appreciate for IPCC to give me chance to introduce the KMA's efforts, and also since I'm not an expert on the scenarios, but I think I will give a short opinion about the scenario after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoon. Okay, thanks everyone for your opening remarks. And I think I'm trying to reflect on the emerging themes in those remarks. And we've heard a lot about how useful scenarios are for policymaking in terms of adaptation and mitigation. We've heard about challenges for communication, the need for data. We've heard also input from Tijal on that pathways has to be kind of within carbon budgets. Also, we've heard that pathways are only used for impacts, and then how challenging is that the pathways development and the classification of pathways and their categorization is changing all the time, and that makes it for the users of this information a more challenging process. I'm aware that Cecilia needs to leave us very soon, so I'm going to give you the first go on this. So you talked a lot about how useful these scenarios in your own mitigation and adaptation planning. Do you find the communication aspect of scenarios input, how are you dealing with that with your own policymakers? What are the challenges? Can you build on that a little bit?
Thank you. I believe everything related with climate change is very challenging whenever we are communicating, because it's full of acronym, a lot of science-based, and it's everything 6.7.8 of the report of, it's very, very difficult. So in the first place, I think that what we are doing or working a lot is within our government and within the different sectors in order to really put all this information available in order them to co-create with us the policies and the programs and the projects that we need from them in order to achieve our goals. So that's one of the first challenges in communicating and all these scenario-based and working with that. And the second thing I think will be, and is one of our main challenges for now coming in the next few months and next year, and is the theme of the COP, implementation. So now we have to implement. So we have to have a lot of discussions and talkings with all the regions. Argentina is a very big country. We are 24 regions. So we are working with every jurisdictions in order to really also design their own scenario planning depending on their conditions and their mitigation adaptation needs following the umbrella of our national plan. And also many times it's a challenge to work and build together. But one of the key things we are doing is building local capacity. I think that's one of the key things we have to do. Developing countries, it's at a national level, but also at the local level. Not only give this report or access to this information, but build the local capacity to understand them, to translate them into policy, and to be able also to co-create and do our own scenarios and analysis and manage the data.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you. Sorry I had...
No problem. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. So we've heard a lot about the issues around equity in these scenarios. And the issues around the assumptions. For instance, in the context of India, they are used more for impact rather than mitigation planning. And even, if I may quote you, Tijal, that even when you use them for impact, you are careful in the way you communicate the findings of the impact based on the assumption of these scenarios. But also what struck me is on the other side that Patricia and Denise, you said that you use them very heavily. So in light of what the points that Tijal has raised, would you build on that? How these aspects factor in your application of scenarios for mitigation and adaptation in terms of equity consideration, in terms of assumptions and so on? Yeah, we could start with Denise, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Let me see how best I can answer this question. In terms of equity, it's kind of difficult to have those scenarios and look at it on an equitable situation, noting that, as I indicated, seeds are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than some of the other countries, not bashing or putting down some of the impacts that other countries are faced, but some of our small island developing states are no longer going to be in existence. And so how we use the scenarios, it's important to translate that message to our communities and let them know that this is dreadful. This is something that is coming about, and if we don't make the change, if developing countries and other countries don't put more ambitions in the mitigation, then it's going to be dreadful for Caribbean seeds, for Pacific seeds, and for seeds as a whole. Some of the issues that we have is that it's difficult to look at it on a original basis as well, because of the lack of data and the lack of information that you have specific for those regions. And it's important that we try to get some regional perspectives on scenarios, looking at regional scenarios that impact the Caribbean, looking at regional scenarios that impact the Pacific Islands as well. So these are some of the areas that we need to target as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Patricia, any do you want to build up on that, please? Thanks.
Yes, so very briefly. So we are cognizant of historical responsibility for emissions, as is also brought out in the IPCC Working Group 1 report. But we also realize that we have a role to play, however small it is, in contributing in emission reductions. So even as we develop our plans, we call for support in transitioning to sustainable or clean development, but we also do what we can as a country in contributing to reducing emissions. For example, in our energy sector, we are looking to reaching net zero by 2030, and this is heavily influenced by the scenarios that come out of the IPCC. And having said that, we also know that adaptation is a very big priority for us. So in as much as we do our part in mitigation, we also call for improved support in funding our adaptation actions, as is also brought out in the IPCC reports that we face the highest impacts, and we are also one of the continents with the highest vulnerabilities. So yeah, we know the need is there for transitioning and a just transition and equity, but we also do our part.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Thank you. Yuan, so one of the aspects that Elizabeth talked about is the fact that the classification of scenarios is changing throughout the process, or from one assessment report to another, we come up with new titles, new classification, as Jim showed in his opening slide. But you also talked a lot about how these scenarios have been very useful in your own context, in your own government planning. Did you find this continuous changes all the time? Did you find this challenging? How did you go about that?
Pardon, but please say one more time.
Sorry?
Please say one more time slowly, please.
Right. Apologies. I'm sorry. Right. So one of the aspects, one of the challenges that Elizabeth reflected on is the way scenarios are categorized, either during within an assessment cycle or across different assessment cycles. These categorizations keep changing. So for instance, in AR5 we had a concentration-based classification of scenarios. In AR6 we built on Paris Agreement with temperature-based classification, and then you've got across different working groups. Sometimes, global warming level is used in working group 1 and 2, but then we use temperature rise in working group 3. And you mentioned in the Korean context that you heavily relied on the use of scenarios in building your adaptation and mitigation planning. So I'm just wondering, how did you deal with the challenge of communication or the different classification of scenarios or the continuous changes, and then sometimes we call them illustrative scenarios in working group 1 and working group 3, there are illustrative mitigation scenarios and so on. So how do you deal with that?
Actually, communicating with other ministry is very difficult for me, since, as you said, the scenario categorization in working group 1, 2, and 3 is a little bit different when other ministry, for example, from the Ministry of Environment or some industry call me to ask about what's the difference between SSP and IMP scenario in working group 3, and they also told me to why IPCC didn't use SSP in working group 3 scenarios, and well, at first time I thought it is very the scenarios are very SSP scenario and IMP scenarios are different, but when I heard the keynote of Professor Jimsky, and I knew that they are very closely linked, but I knew, but although I am the IPCC, I am the focal point of IPCC, but I knew it at this time. So I think for the AR7 scenarios, some enough explanation in the summary for policymaker might be might be very great, because I think the policymakers are just see the result, not see the progress of making scenarios. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. I would like to move back to Tijal. So you mentioned that one plausible way forward is to have a carbon budget and pathways that reach this carbon budget. Can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Say that to think that the IMs are the only way in which we can model futures, I think would be very restrictive in terms of imagining how we can go about this. Unfortunately, this is what the entire focus of Working Group 3 has been on IMs, the vetting criteria, etc., at least in chapter 3, if not in the other chapters, but definitely. And these really pervade the narrative across the report. Even if they are restricted to one chapter, the narrative of scenarios is really throughout. It's there in the SSPs. And if you look at the media reports and the numbers that are reported in terms of what is required, it's from the scenarios. So, I mean, we can say that it's not really, and technically we all know that these scenarios are illustrative, etc. If you're talking to a group of modelers or statisticians, they'll probably interpret it differently, but that's not how the world interprets them. And so therefore, it is possible, for example, and let me answer your question. You think of the carbon budget, this is the global commons. You think about the equitable sharing of the carbon budget, and if everybody has to stay within their fair share of the carbon budget, there are various ways, and then within their national circumstances, how is it that they stay within the carbon budget is really how countries should perhaps think about it. What we do when we do this, we only start thinking about it in terms of a global mitigation pathway, then are we sort of also saying that all the regional assumptions that underlie those mitigation pathways, is it possible to achieve the same mitigation pathways with different regional assumptions? Can you, for example, get the C1 scenario pathways in Working Group 3 with assumptions that have much higher reductions in GDP, in consumption, in energy access and energy use, in fossil fuel use, and much higher levels of sequestration in the developed countries? Currently, the levels that are assumed, so you have, let's say, have a scenario where all of these assumptions for the developed countries are much higher in accordance with what their fair share of the carbon budget is, and for the developing countries in accordance with what their fair share of the carbon budget is. Nobody is allowed to exceed that fair share. And do you have different outcomes? The problem, however, is I don't think the IIMs are structured to be able to do this. You can do this if you think of different modeling frameworks, whether you can do it with the IIMs. So if you think about scenarios for the future, I think within the IPCC, there has to be an expansion on what modeling frameworks and in general frameworks we use to imagine futures for ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tejal. That makes it a lot clearer for us now. Just to come back to you, sorry, one more question. When we talk about equitable sharing, and we've seen how approvals could be challenging, how would you think? Is there one framework of equitable sharing that would go through an approval process, or multiple frameworks? And then because if we present multiple frameworks and then each government pick and choose, then we are not on the same page anymore, right?
Yeah, but you can, just like you have 1,200 scenarios, you can have multiple ways of thinking about how you equitably share the carbon budget. I'm not saying it's not a contested issue. I'm not saying it's not a contested terrain, but that is basically what a political consensus is supposed to achieve. But what the science tells us is that there is a limited carbon budget. The science doesn't tell us that if you take one particular pathway, that's the only pathway to stay within that budget. I think one thing that is clear from the IPCC Working Group 1 scenarios is also, and that this is also a disclaimer that's given in the Working Group 1 scenarios, that multiple scenarios are possible that correspond with the same carbon budget, right? And so it's not one particular scenario, it's multiple scenarios. Then how is it that if the global commons is the carbon budget, how do you share that global carbon budget? On what metrics, on what parameters, is a matter of political debate and discussion. It's not something, and there are different scientific views also. Yeah. There are different social scientific views on it as well. But all of these then should be reflected in the IPCC assessment. So this is another framework for thinking about it, other than the IMs.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm aware that it's me and the panelists. So we'll turn to the panelists, and I'll turn to you, Elizabeth, because you talked about that you're using SSPs kind of as a framework, but the data itself is not fit for the Canadian context, if I may interpret it that way. And reflecting on what Tijal is saying, do you think that's a way forward?
Yeah, thank you, Ala. I'd actually like to just pick up on something that my colleague from Korea mentioned about sort of how and I think it relates back that as these scenario frameworks keep changing, it actually it increases some of our communication issues around them. And so in some ways, it's recognizing that the science is moving along, these scenarios are trying to answer more and more relevant questions, but in doing so, it makes it more difficult for us to then communicate that back, both in terms of what we roll out to practitioners. They ask us a lot of really, really tough questions, and we get answers, and then we need to change our answers, and that's very frustrating for them. But also with our policymakers, what they really want to know is what's lying behind these scenarios. And so I think these calls for transparency, for plausibility, as well as trying to answer some of their emerging questions. We've become increasingly worried about 1.5 degrees Celsius. What can the IPCC scenarios lend, for example, on some of our more difficult challenges, like communicating overshoot, communicating the ability for ecosystem-based mitigation and adaptation within that world, and helping us learn more about the potential for CDR. And so while we appreciate these products so much because they help bound the space in which we're communicating, I think these calls to ensure that the scenarios are socialized early enough that we can take a good look at them, and that we can use these in a way and even help line them up with some of the expectations of our policymakers. Right, our policymakers have a very sophisticated set of expectations that they're bringing to the table. And when they look at these scenarios, they're looking for some of that same clarity about how these line up with various expectations that they may have. And so that's really where we would push for an AR7, is to try to open that up a little bit more, and also to try to increase some of the articulation of what's lying behind these results. Thank you.
Elizabeth. Okay, so we have limited time to go, so I would like to propose the following. We'll pick up a couple of questions from the floor, and then closing remarks, about 30 seconds each, about recommendations for AR7 from your perspective, which will hopefully feed into our scenarios workshop, and then 1 minute or 2 minutes from Jim, and then Yuni. Right, any questions from the floor, please? Or questions from the online audience as well? Right, I don't see any hands. Okay, we've been very comprehensive and exhaustive, I think, which is great. Okay, so one final remark, 30 seconds if I may, about your so we have the scenarios workshop in end of April 2023. What are your recommendations to the participants of the workshop, which of course you will be invited to participate in that workshop as well? So 30 seconds each, please, starting with you, Patricia. Thank you.
So our recommendations would be to look at ways that we can have more models incorporated and particularly talking about support for modelers from Africa and from the developed world who may be able to capture the intricacies that we have in our regions that are not otherwise seen by the models that exist. Additionally, for AR7, if we are developing new models or improving on what exists, better communication for policymakers and for the scientists using them to be able to fully understand. A workshop of some sort to enable us to interact with the scientists would be very useful.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Denise, please.
Thank you. And so for AR7, we're looking at having regional trajectories, looking at specific areas in regional information, modeling specific developing capacities in the regions so that people who are there who understand the national circumstances of each country's areas, each region, to help develop some of those models in AR7. I think this is very important. Also improving on the data. Data is lacking, as I indicated again, in a lot of the small island developing states. How can we improve that data? How can we access funding or bring funding into those areas that need improved monitoring and improved data in that area? And then finally looking at costing. When we look at costing, those models for costing, small island developing states who bring in everything through shipments and have to deal with those additional costs, it doesn't take in perspective the situation for each for the small island developing states, and that's important to consider. So to consider regional perspectives, regional trajectories, that's important for AR7.
Thank you very much. Moving to Tijal. Also 30 seconds, please.
Yes. So going beyond integrated assessment models and not start our thinking about how we achieve 1.5 in the least cost way, which is what the IMs do, but how do we achieve our temperature targets, the Paris Agreement goals, in the most equitable way, which is what I think we need to do as we go forward. And that is something that we should foreground when we think about what modeling studies or what studies itself, not just modeling studies, what studies we need to call for, look for, assess, and include in assessments going forward.
Thank you. Elizabeth, please.
Thank you. We are hesitant, as always, to put new tasks on the IPCC outside of what we consider to be their core functions. But in this case, we would benefit greatly from understanding more about those integrated assessment models and how those scenarios are being developed. We would also like to see those scenarios being socialized much earlier and explaining their use across the working groups. That would go a long way towards helping us communicate the bigger picture that these scenarios are meant to convey.
Thank you very much. And if I may, in one sentence, what's your recommendation for AR7? Yes, for you. Yes, please. Yeah, one. Yes.
I just want one thing. I said before, linkage and relationship between scenarios to be shown with clarity to policymaker and non-expert. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if I may summarize the shopping list: regional trajectories, communication, more models or building capacity for modeling, data access, costing based on region beyond IAMs or no least cost, equity, better understanding of IAMs and scenarios. So I'll take this with me to the scenarios workshop and make sure of that. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Jim. Thank you.
Okay, Ala is showing how to manage as manager. He's given me 1 minute to finish off here. So just to say, it was good to hear that the scenarios are actually proving of use to people. So I think that was one strong message. Something I picked up especially from Africa and the Caribbean was the importance of covering adaptation and impacts in the scenarios, and more geographical specificity would really help there. From Tejal, we will continue these conversations. I think this question of the shared socioeconomic pathways is something we need to think about. Some of your problems would have been addressed had the community made more use of SSP1, which contains some but not all of the elements of things that you were looking for. So I think that is quite important. And one point I would make, it's not just integrated assessment models. It is one chapter of our report. We have a chapter on national models as well, and we have many, many chapters on what can specifically be done in sectors and systems and how these can be enabled. And we really hope these are practical messages for policymakers. And just finally to say, we still have to design the workshop in detail, but my personal view on this is that we need to work backwards from what we want to get out of it. And I think it needs to be recommendations for the research communities, recommendations for IPCC, and probably recommendations for research funders as well, who often steer the kind of inquiry that takes place. But I really thought it was really valuable stuff that we got back from the panel, so thanks for all the insights.
So I found this dialogue is extremely useful, and I hope that we can have this kind of event again before AI7 starting. Okay, so before closing, I'd like to invite Mr. Kim again for closing remark.
Very briefly, I really cannot thank you enough for your dedicated, very informative and thoughtful dialogue for future climate scenario. Just a minute ago, I talked to the head of KMA, which is supporting the IPCC as a kind of shareholder, and Dr. Yu Hee-dong promised that he would provide an event for you next year in Seoul, maybe in Busan, where Professor Lee Junhee is living, to show our gratitude in another way. And also, I also want to express my deep gratitude for your great contribution in Songdo several years ago for that special report, which meant a lot to the world. Again, you are the heroes of the world. For that, next year's event in Seoul, please be mindful, prepare special edition of the summary of policymaker for my president, Yoon Sung-yeol, okay? Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Lee Junhee, for your dedicated contribution to this session.
Okay, so yeah, before closing, so there will be group photo right after the finishing this event. Then thank you so much for the keynote speaker, James Key, and all the panelists. The discussion was wonderful, and I think we inform those discussion to IPCC broader community and how we can improve the next cycle. Okay, thank you all, and this is the end of the event. Thank you so much.